Well, welcome to At the Table with the Asian American Christian Collaborative, or AACC. At the Table is a series of roundtable discussions that we at AACC are trying to host, where Asian American Christians, Christian leaders, and pastors are able to draw from their experiences, their education, and their expertise to discuss questions and issues and matters that impact the Asian American Christian community at large, namely within the church. We're here today at the historic Chinese Community Church of Washington, D.C., located in the heart of Chinatown in our nation's capital. The church was founded in 1935 and is the only Chinese church in the proper D.C. area. I'm so glad to be with all of you. My name is Chang. I serve as the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, but I'm here with you, Andrea Ackermann, who's the pastor of Community Life at Christ City Church in D.C. I'm with Angela Chang, no relation, but we're probably related, some distant cousin, because apparently through Genghis Khan, there's like 10% of the Asian population that's related, neither here nor there, who is diving into work that matters in terms of discipleship and spiritual formation. Your husband is also a pastor, and so that means by default, within an Asian American context, you are also in nearly vocational full-time ministry, and that's probably something we'd like to talk about. And of course with Daniel Park, who is the lead pastor of Restoration Church in Reston, Virginia. So glad to be with y'all.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Well, let's start with just your experiences. Tell us about your experience in the church that as you've navigated growing up, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about the church that you grew up and navigating it as a man or a woman.
Sure, happy to start. I grew up in the Maryland suburbs, so not too far from here. I grew up as a pastor's kid in a Southern Baptist church. And the church that I grew up in was half white, half black. And I was one of the 3 Asian Americans that I knew at my church, which the other 2 would be my sisters. Growing up in a church that didn't officially affirm women in leadership was really formative for me, especially as a kid who was very precocious, and I tended to lead things that I was on, like ended up being the leader of things as I came up through my youth group. There were things that I was asked to do that stopped when I turned 18. And that journey and being raised in that kind of an environment certainly informed the way that I look at my faith, and it has certainly informed the way that I have approached now being a woman who is in pastoral ministry, which was a longer journey. So there's been some ups and downs and bumps for me.
Thanks for sharing that. I hope you delve more into that as we continue the conversation.
Sure.
I grew up in a church, a Presbyterian church primarily, and in Pennsylvania, and then grew up in a church in Maryland. Eventually, when I got married, we moved out to California, and we've been serving at Asian American churches and predominantly white churches. And then we recently moved back to Maryland about a year ago, and we're serving in a predominantly Asian church again now. So as a pastor's wife, I've just been trying to focus more on serving the younger ladies at our church and discipling them and just doing life with them, like life on life type of ministry. Yeah.
Well, I grew up in a Korean American immigrant church in New York City, and my father was the pastor. It was a Methodist church, and one of the things that as I reflect on growing up in that context is that as being male, gender was not something that I was thinking about. That I didn't come to actually think about. The fact that I wasn't thinking about gender role in the church didn't occur to me until I was already in seminary and in that space of talking about those types of conversations and issues. So I'm now ever so reflective of the formative experiences of our lives are just so key to having us think about gender roles. And I look at my parents, my dad being the pastor of the church and my mom being the pastor's wife, a very traditional pastor's wife in a Korean church context. She was doing a ton of things behind the scenes and no credit for it, no role to it whatsoever. And of course, there's my dad who's out in the front and he's the leader, and that starts to shape, unbeknownst to you, what gender roles actually are. But now I'm in a context where my wife is a pastor, and I'm raising 3 daughters, and the youngest, I have 4 kids, and my youngest is a son. So now the conversation is very different. And so the formative experiences have shaped not just the assumptions I've had, but a lot of intentional changes and thoughts that I have now.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, even for myself, when I grew up only seeing male leaders, male pastors, male elders, mostly, even though I'm like a denominational mutt, you know, like everyone at one point was a Presbyterian, maybe except for you because your dad was Methodist. We have 2 PKs here. Everyone seems to have, especially if you're Korean American, like that seems to be a very consistent theme, is like Presbyterianism or some form of Methodism. Every now and then you get some Baptists in, but then. Yeah, it wasn't until I lived in Korea where my parents took us to a church, and it might have been a Free Methodist church, where the senior pastor was a woman in Korea, and there are all sorts of things that we can dive into there about like the posture she had to take and like her personality and whether that was a contributing factor to her leadership and all that stuff. She was single, you know, she was like almost 50 or 60 years old probably when she was pastoring, and how that might have impacted like her vocational decision it might have impacted her ability to get married or not get married. So those are things I don't know, but it changed the imagination of like what a woman in leadership could be or a female pastor was. And so, but that wasn't until I was like 13 or 14. But for an Asian American, I feel like that's far earlier than maybe some of the others. And obviously there's so much to kind of unpack there. But I'm wondering, like, how has those experiences, like, I mean, you've kind of touched on them, but how have they shaped your understanding of the role of women within the church broadly? You know, I mean, when I grew up, for example, the women were primarily in the kitchen after service, cooking and cleaning. The men would, maybe do like the big cleanup, like the yard work of the church. You know, taking down the trees and clearing out the branches. They would do all the construction stuff and the heavy lifting, and so it kind of fixated in my mind what men are like you were saying, what women are like, and then when it came to kind of church leadership, how the decisions were made, who was speaking, who was doing the teaching, who people were teaching to. That was all kind of, that shaped the way that I viewed things as well. And so I'm curious how your upbringing kind of impacted your kind of journey, your convictions, your commitments.
Yeah, I kind of grew up with that similar mentality, I think. Especially regarding pastors' wives, like they always play the piano and they always, are serving or cooking, and but yeah, becoming a pastor's wife myself, I don't play piano, and those types of things I do appreciate. But one thing that I've been learning, especially from a lot of the younger women at our church, is like the more like Gen Z right now is just how to speak up for yourself and have a voice and to be heard. A lot of those things that I never really would have thought of myself, or I never thought was I never thought that I actually could have a voice until I've been looking at some of the younger generation and how they've been speaking up more and being more vocal and kind of not demanding change, but like they've been really on the forefront of just kind of having the male leaders kind of listen to what they have to say and have a voice and request certain things because they've experienced some inequalities in the past. And it's actually become a big hot button issue in our church recently, and we've been kind of wrestling with this, especially like just seeing the differences generationally and how things are changing. And so it's really urging me to also like think differently and how a lot of the women in our church do have a lot of amazing things to say, and we do have a woman children's pastor right now, but she is very intelligent and has a lot of wonderful things to say, and she has been able to speak to the congregation and really have an impactful voice. And so it's really challenging my thought process also as far as women in leadership. And so, yeah.
I always found it fascinating that growing up, you see the women in the church, they do have a lot to say, and they have so much influence and input in different ministries of the church. And then it's funny that when you're in a worship service, you never see a woman up on stage or on the altar area leading the prayer or doing the scripture reading. You never elect a woman as an elder of the church. And when there's a church meeting happening, I'm quite sure a lot of the opinions that were being expressed are shared by women in the church, but it's always their husbands that come up to the microphone to speak. And you don't question it too much. In my context, being male, you don't really think about that. But then you really do some reflection now and like, oh, that influenced me probably in a lot of ways that I didn't even realize. I recently went back to my home church, and they hit 40 years anniversary, and they created this historical like display with all these pictures of 40 years. And they had a photograph wall with all the elders that have served the church, and they're all men. All men, and I'm staring at this wall, I'm thinking, wow, and they, not to question all their sacrifice and their faithfulness and all of that, but it reminds me of the context that I was raised in, and how differently I've taken a very different path related to that. And I think at one point when I was questioning that, the biblical reason for that is what oftentimes in 1 Timothy 2:12 is quoted, that women should be silent. Women should not exercise authority over a man. And that just kind of reverberates through and through. And yet, my understanding even of that passage has changed. And even in my own life, having my spouse being a pastor as well, but I have 3 daughters who are so, I had a conversation with my daughter recently, my oldest one, and she said, all along, women pastors in my life was either my mom or they were children's pastors, not pastors of adults. We're part of a church where we're a multi-site church, and the senior pastor and one of the associate pastors of the other campus are female. And my daughter said, for the first time, besides my mom, I see a lead pastor of not a small church, but a large church, being female. And now I can see that there's no limitation to the gifts that females can bring to the church. There's no boundaries to that. So big contrast between where I am now, and I'm even looking at the future with my children, and where I come from.
For me, I can certainly see now that what growing up in an environment like that, where again, very similarly, you see women just in these very specific places in the church, but never, up front, never from the stage, unless it's not adults, unless it's children. I can see and say now that what that did for me was stunt my imagination. Had no clue that was a thing that women could do or should do. And so as I became an adult and was being told by folks in the community that I was in, hey, we think you have pastoral gifts. It was really difficult for me to even hear that. There's so much of like, oh, no. Like, you're just thinking, it's just because I'm loud or because, I can speak my mind. You're just that. It's not that I have gifts. It was difficult for me to even receive that kind of positive feedback and support. I think, thinking about the role of women in my church growing up, and just historically, the role of women in churches. Women have always led in churches. Women have always taught in churches, have certainly led, have been influential in big decisions that are made throughout church history. They're just not recognized as such. And I think when I came to the point of decision of, can I be a pastor? Is this something that I'm actually able to do? I realized that my hesitancy to do that, or even my self-doubt in that decision, was less actually about my ability to be able to do it, or even my calling to be able to do it. It was less about that, because women have been doing those things forever. Right. It was less about that, and it was more about the structural barriers that kept women from being recognized, that kept the gifts of women kind of at a certain level. And so I think that I have found so much freedom in that even now. Imposter syndrome is such a thing for women everywhere, and certainly for women in ministry, and certainly for me, and recognizing that it's not about me being inadequate. It's about, there are barriers that are outside of my control that are keeping me from feeling like I'm able to step into this.
Yeah, that's all very helpful, and I'm glad that we're able to share that, because I think when I survey the landscape, I see the arguments on, let's just say, for the sake of simplification, the complementarian and the egalitarian side, even though I don't know if it's a category in every place that we go to, and most people don't even adhere to that. I think that you look at the African American church or the Black church, and they don't necessarily adhere to the same categories of complementarian and egalitarian as the white evangelical church would. You go across the pond in either direction, and there are different understandings of the role of women, the role of men, and some of that with honest wrestling of scripture, as well as shaped by cultural forces. I do think that when you just look at biblical exegesis in its purest form, it seems like people can reasonably get to a complementarian position and reasonably get to an egalitarian position. Mm-hmm. And yet it's so divisive within the church that it leads to almost like a standstill. Mm-hmm. But when you look into church history, the first to proclaim the gospel were women, right. to announce the resurrection. When you look at some of the major pivotal moments in Scripture, it was through the mouths of women that those things were announced. And then there are a handful of passages in which those who would say, well, there are specific roles for men and specific roles for women that should never be crossed. Even when you wrestle with them, there are different interpretations that people can land on, especially if they take in the fuller context, and then they look at the broader church history, like you were saying. As you look at the landscape of, the conversation, because we're not actually having a conversation on what the role of men in leadership, because that's never been like an issue that we've had to wrestle with. Kind of like you said, it wasn't something you could think about, because the path for a male in leadership was always there. But there have always been barriers, especially within an Asian American context. And I think if you're in a Korean American church context, generally there are more barriers than in a Chinese American church context, where there seems to be more avenues for female leadership that can minister to both. Your comment about until the age of, as soon as you were 18, I mean, one of the statistics show that women really undergird the foundation of the church through volunteerism, serving, leading, in a variety of contexts, and yet they're not often recognized for it. And we understand that there's virtue in doing things with humility and not needing recognition for it, but it seems like it's a pretty systemic and pervasive issue. Yeah. So the question I think I want to ask is, regardless of people's positions, especially as you draw from your own experience, and then this will be our last question for this, whether people are complementarian or egalitarian, whether they believe that women can teach and be elders or not, what do they need to consider when it comes to women leading and serving in the church? right? Because we're having this conversation, and I wish that it was, we're going to have more of these conversations for sure, and we want to have like a breadth of opinions and perspectives more often in the same room. But I'm curious, what would you say? What do people need to consider?
I think we need to have a real hard look at the last 2,000 years of the church and look at the history, regardless of titles and roles you want to put on people. To your point, the first proclaimer of the gospel, the resurrection, was Mary Magdalene. There's that. There's even the woman at the well who went to her village in Samaria and just told everybody about Jesus. I mean, proclaiming the gospel is not limited to gender roles. That is something that we just need to fully recognize. And every historical movement in the church has not only been largely through women, but women have had very, very influential leadership roles in making it happen. They're not just passive participants in a mass movement or something like that. I think about even like the Korean context of missionaries from the United States or other places in Europe going to Korea. The great majority of those missionaries were all women who are giving their lives to, like if you go to Korea and you go to Yanghwajin Missionary Cemetery, Foreign Missionary Cemetery, and you go by all those gravestones, these are women who've given up their lives. And they were discipling people, they were preaching the gospel. A lot of these historical pastors in Korea, whether it was during Japanese colonialism or post-Korean War period where the Korean church just started to thrive and grow, that was as a result of the missionary work, and we can't deny that piece of history. I remember going there and to that cemetery, and this one gravestone I walked by was a missionary named Ruby Kendrick, and it's on her gravestone. It says, "If I had 1,000 lives, I'd give it all to Korea." You know, and that reminds me that, you know, so much of the gender roles you see happening in, at least in my observation and experience of the Korean American church context, is so much more cultural than actually the lived out, you know, history of the church. Bringing that lens, for me, helps understanding with scripture. Even this past week, as I was thinking through this, that word authority, as we talk about exegesis, the word authority in that one passage of 1 Timothy 2:12 is found in that one verse, like that. The Greek word for that is only found in that verse. It's not found anywhere else. So it's a completely different definition. It refers to abuse of authority. And we can get into what kind of authority, but it's more talking about abuse of authority, that in that particular context, that women should not abuse authority, whatever authority that they had. And I think that's open to interpretation too, but I think that's a very key piece of exegesis we need to bring. And the last thing for me that's really been a game changer is that if Christ came to redeem the fall, then let's take a look at what it looked like pre-fall. Because the whole hierarchy, the gender hierarchy, whatever that's talked about is usually what happened post-fall. And as Christ followers, let's really think about what's been helpful is how do we think about the redemptive work of Christ that now affects gender roles instead of continuing to perpetuate what might have been put into place because of the fall of humanity. So those are important tools that I bring and I think about that has helped me choose a different path than what I experienced while I was growing up.
I think that it's important for people for the sake of this conversation, both sides. It's a spectrum, right? It's certainly not one camp, another camp, but for folks on both sides of that spectrum to recognize that we do hold more things in common, I think, than we think. We would all hold that people are made in the image of God, all gender. We would hold that there isn't inherently a gender that is more valuable to God than the other. We would all hold to that. I would also say, even as a person who falls on a particular spot in the spectrum, as we all do, that, you know, on the complementarian side of things, I don't think that men and women do things exactly the same, nor should they. I think that there are ways that women can step into leadership roles that look very different than what church leadership roles have looked like historically. I think that actually that is only a benefit for the church at large. Not that men aren't doing enough or good enough or whatever it is, let's stay away from that kind of language. It's that women can bring something that just hasn't been seen in leadership. I'm a different pastor than my male colleagues for many reasons, certainly one of those being I'm a woman. I see things a particular way. I would hope that people can recognize that there are similarities, that we do hold some commonalities and look towards those. And I would also hope, I think particularly for folks who fall a bit more on the complementarian side of the spectrum, I would hope that, as we've said, women are still leading. Women will continue to lead. Whether or not they're recognized for it is the church structure issue. So, and that's a men's conversation as well, is what do we do with that? But I think with the recognition that women will continue to lead, have been leading, I would love for people to be thinking about how do we honor, how do we value and express that value of what women do to the highest level that our convictional conscience will allow us to. And kind of, there's a big spectrum of that, whatever that means, levels of hierarchy or whatever, all of those things. But I would love to see women in positions all the way up to, again, the convictional consciousness of church leadership. I would love to see that, because I think a lot of times people are like, nope, we don't allow women in leadership as elders or pastors. Okay, where do you allow women? Get women there. Churches will only benefit when men and women partner together in leadership. And individual churches, denominations have the freedom to be able to figure out what that looks like specifically for them, but would love to see more of a normalization of women in leadership all the way that they're able to in different church contexts. And for the structural issues of women not being in leadership, again, in whatever way that looks for your particular church, to be addressed.
Thanks for sharing that. Want to bring us home?
Systemically, I do agree, we shouldn't thwart women's abilities or their voices, what they can bring to the table. At the same time, I don't see women wanting to be in authoritative roles for the sake of, recognition or power. But I think really, as I interpret the Bible all throughout, we're looking at the heart of the issue. And if it's, there's a lot of disagreements, and I just hope to see a lot of just looking at the heart behind the matter, and really, giving women the opportunity, not thwarting them systemically, but allowing them to express themselves using their giftings and talents as their God-given talent. They should be able to freely use those things. But yeah, I do. I think where it gets me is when there is more like divisiveness or legalistic discordance, that I would like to see a lot more just understanding and unity, and understanding that that we can work together on these issues.
Thanks, that's a good word to end on. Well, thanks for being at the table with us and having this conversation. It's not always an easy one, and one that has many facets to it. I'm looking forward to having more.